The dust cloud on the horizon told Jackson Zimmerman something was wrong before he even saw the crumpled figure lying face down in the middle of the trail. And when his mare whinnied nervously as they approached, he knew this wasn't just another drifter sleeping off a bottle of whiskey. He swung down from his saddle quickly, his boots hitting the hard, packed earth of the Colorado Territory Trail with a thud that sent up small puffs of dust in the late afternoon sun. The woman lay completely still, her dark hair matted with dried blood, her dress torn and covered in dirt. Jackson dropped to his knees beside her, his calloused fingers reaching for her throat to check for a pulse. Relief flooded through him when he felt the faint but steady beat beneath her skin. "Madam, can you hear me?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, but there was no response. He looked around the empty trail, scanning the surrounding scrubland and distant mountains for any sign of what had happened, or who might have done this. Nothing moved except the sage brush swaying in the hot wind. He couldn't leave her here to die under the merciless sun that was already starting to sink toward the western peaks. Jackson carefully turned her over, wincing at the bruise that had formed along her jaw and the cut above her eyebrow that had bled considerably. Her skin was pale beneath the dirt and sun damage, her lips cracked from dehydration. He uncapped his canteen and wet his bandana, gently dabbing at her face to clean away some of the blood. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably mid-20s, and despite her current condition, he could see she had delicate features and a determined set to her jaw even in unconsciousness. He needed to get her back to his ranch, but it was still 5 miles away and the sun would be setting in a couple hours. Jackson lifted her carefully into his arms, surprised at how light she felt, and managed to get her onto his horse, settling her in front of the saddle before climbing up behind her. He held her against his chest with one arm while guiding his mare with the other, keeping the pace steady but quick enough to cover ground. The ride seemed to take forever. Jackson found himself talking to her even though she couldn't hear him, telling her she was going to be fine, that he'd get her help, that she just needed to hold on. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breathing shallow but consistent. He could feel the heat radiating from her body and knew she was running a fever. By the time they reached his property, the sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His ranch wasn't much, just a simple cabin he'd built himself 3 years ago when he'd saved enough money working cattle drives to buy his own piece of land. He had a small barn, a corral with his 3 horses, and about 50 acres of decent grazing land. It was simple, but it was his, and right now he was grateful he lived alone and could take care of this woman without anyone asking questions she might not want to answer. Jackson carried her inside and laid her on his bed, the only real bed in the cabin. He lit several oil lamps and stoked the fire in the stove, then pumped fresh water into a basin. He'd learned basic field medicine during his years riding with various outfits, patching up cowboys who'd been kicked by horses or gored by cattle. This was different, though. This required a gentleness he wasn't sure he possessed. He cleaned her wounds methodically, starting with the cut on her head. It wasn't as bad as it had looked initially. Head wounds always bled like hell, but she'd have a scar. The bruises on her arms and face told a story he didn't like. Someone had hurt her, and badly. As he worked, checking her ribs for breaks and examining her ankles which were scraped raw, he felt anger building in his chest. What kind of person did this to a defenseless woman and left her to die in the middle of nowhere? She stirred slightly when he was bandaging her head, a small moan escaping her lips. Jackson paused, watching her face for signs of consciousness, but she didn't wake. He finished his work and covered her with his extra blankets, then pulled his chair beside the bed to keep watch. He didn't know who she was or what had happened to her, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anything else bad happen to her while she was under his roof. The night passed slowly. Jackson dozed in his chair but woke frequently to check on her, to feel her forehead for fever, to make sure she was still breathing. Around midnight, she started thrashing, crying out in her sleep. He held her shoulders gently, speaking in low, soothing tones until she settled again. Her fever had spiked, and he spent the next few hours applying cool cloths to her forehead and neck, forcing small amounts of water between her lips. Dawn was breaking when her eyes finally opened. They were a striking green color, wide with confusion and fear as they darted around the unfamiliar room before landing on him. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse and dehydration. "You're safe," Jackson said, keeping his distance so he wouldn't frighten her. "I'm Jackson Zimmerman. I found you on the trail yesterday afternoon. You were unconscious. I brought you to my ranch to help you." She tried to sit up but immediately fell back with a groan, her hand going to her head. "What happened? I can't remember." "I was hoping you could tell me." "You had quite a knock to the head. Do you remember your name?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment Jackson thought she'd passed out again, but then she opened them and looked at him with those startling green eyes. Grace Reynolds." "Well, Miss Reynolds, you're lucky to be alive." "Can you remember anything about how you ended up out there?" Grace's brow furrowed as she tried to concentrate, and Jackson could see the effort causing her pain. "There was a wagon. We were traveling from Denver to somewhere. I can't remember where. There were men. They stopped us. They were shouting." Her breathing quickened, panic starting to set in. "Where's my uncle? He was driving the wagon. Where is he?" Jackson's expression grew somber. "There was no one else on the trail when I found you, just you lying in the dirt. No wagon, no horses, nothing. I'm sorry." Tears filled Grace's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "They killed him. They must have killed him and taken everything." Her voice broke on the last word, and she turned her face away from him. "Uncle Thomas was all I had left." Jackson felt his heart clench at the raw pain in her voice. He wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. He wasn't good with words or emotions, had spent most of his 32 years alone or in the company of men who didn't talk about feelings. But something about this woman's grief moved him in a way he'd never experienced before. "I'm real sorry about your uncle," he said quietly, "but you're safe here. You can stay as long as you need to get your strength back. Nobody's going to hurt you while you're under my roof. I promise you that." Grace wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, wincing at the movement. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Because it's the right thing to do," Jackson said simply. "Now you need to rest and get your strength back. When you're feeling better, we can talk about what happened and what you want to do, but for now, just focus on healing." Over the next few days, Jackson fell into a routine of caring for Grace. He made broth from the chicken he kept for eggs, coaxing her to eat small amounts several times a day. He changed her bandages and brought her fresh water. He slept on the floor near the fire, giving her privacy and space to recover. At first, their conversations were brief and centered around her immediate needs, but as her strength returned, they began to talk more. Grace told him she'd been living in Denver with her uncle since her parents died of influenza 2 years ago. Her uncle had been a merchant, and they'd been traveling to establish a new store in a growing town in southern Colorado. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and now completely alone in the world with no money and nowhere to go. Jackson told her about his own life, how he'd been orphaned young and raised in various cattle outfits, learning the trade from the ground up. He talked about saving every penny he could to buy this land, about his dreams of building a real ranch with a decent herd. He didn't mention that in 3 years of owning this place, she was the first woman who'd ever set foot inside his cabin. By the end of the first week, Grace was able to sit up and move around the cabin slowly, though her head still ached and she tired easily. Jackson was constantly amazed by her resilience. Despite everything she'd been through, she maintained a quiet dignity and even attempted to help with small tasks, though he insisted she rest. "I can't just lie in your bed forever," she protested one morning as he brought her breakfast. "You've been sleeping on the floor because of me." "It's not right. I've slept on the ground more nights than I can count," Jackson replied, setting the plate on the small table beside the bed. "A wood floor with a blanket is luxury compared to rocky ground with a saddle for a pillow. You need that bed to heal proper." "But I'm feeling much better now. I should be doing something to earn my keep." Jackson sat down in his chair and regarded her seriously. "Miss Reynolds, you were left for dead less than 2 weeks ago. Your body needs time to recover fully. There's no rush. I don't expect you to earn anything. You're a guest, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Grace looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're a very unusual man, Mr. Zimmerman. Most men I've known wouldn't be so kind to a stranger. Just Jackson, please." "And I'm not doing anything special, just what anyone decent would do." "That's where you're wrong," Grace said softly. "Decency isn't as common as it should be. I've learned that the hard way." As the days turned into weeks, something subtle began to shift between them. Jackson found himself looking forward to their conversations over simple meals. Grace had a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh in ways he hadn't in years. She asked about his horses, his plans for the ranch, his thoughts on everything from the best way to break a colt to his opinions on the political situation in Colorado Territory. For her part, Grace found herself drawn to Jackson's quiet strength and genuine kindness. He was nothing like the men she'd known in Denver, the shopkeepers and businessmen who'd courted her with flowery words and empty promises. Jackson spoke plainly, but when he said something, she knew he meant it. He was tall and lean from years of hard work, with brown hair that was always slightly too long and brown eyes that seemed to see right through any pretense. One evening, about 3 weeks after Jackson had found her, Grace was standing at the window watching the sunset when he came in from tending the horses. She'd been thinking about her future, about what she was going to do. She couldn't stay here forever, imposing on Jackson's hospitality, but she had nowhere to go and no money to get there. "It's beautiful here," she said without turning around. "So different from the city, quieter." Jackson washed his hands in the basin and came to stand a respectful distance behind her. "You miss Denver." "I miss what Denver represented. Civilization, I suppose. Culture and society and all those things we're taught to value." She turned to face him. "But if I'm being honest, I never really fit in there. I was too opinionated for polite society. My uncle used to say I spoke my mind too freely for a lady." "Nothing wrong with speaking your mind," Jackson said. "Better than pretending to be something you're not." Grace smiled, and Jackson noticed how it transformed her face, making her eyes light up. "That's what I mean. You're different. You don't expect me to be some fragile flower who needs protecting from the harsh realities of life." "You survived being left for dead in the middle of nowhere," Jackson pointed out. "You're not fragile. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Grace felt her cheeks warm and she looked away first. "I've been thinking," she said, changing the subject. "I need to start planning what I'm going to do. I've imposed on your kindness long enough." "You're not imposing," Jackson said, more sharply than he intended. He softened his tone. "Sorry." I just mean you're welcome here. There's no rush for you to leave. But I can't stay forever. You have your life, your work. You didn't sign up to have a permanent house guest." Jackson was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful. "What if you stayed on? Not as a guest, but as a partner of sorts. This ranch needs more than one person to run it proper. I've been doing everything myself, but with help, we could really make something of this place. I could pay you wages, give you your own room. We could build an addition to the cabin." Grace turned to look at him sharply. "Are you offering me a job, Jackson Zimmerman?" "I'm offering you a place to stay and a way to support yourself until you figure out what you want to do," he said. "No strings attached. You'd have your independence and your safety. And honestly, I could use the help. I've been wanting to expand, maybe get some chickens, plant a bigger garden. Things I don't have time for when I'm handling the horses and cattle by myself." It was a practical offer, Grace knew, but something in the way Jackson was looking at her told her it was more than that. He wanted her to stay. The realization made her heart beat faster. "I don't know much about ranching," she said slowly. "I didn't either when I started. You learn by doing. And you're smart. You'll pick it up quick." Grace thought about it. The alternative was trying to get to one of the towns and finding work as a seamstress or a cook, or worse, ending up in a saloon. She had no family, no references, no money. Jackson was offering her not just survival, but a real opportunity. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, but I earn my keep. I'm not a charity case." Jackson's smile was genuine and reached his eyes. "Deal, we'll start tomorrow. I'll show you around the property proper, and we can make plans for that expansion." That night, lying in Jackson's bed while he slept on his makeshift pallet by the fire, Grace stared at the ceiling and wondered what she was getting herself into. She'd never imagined herself as a ranch woman, had always thought she'd marry some merchant or businessman and live a conventional city life. But then again, she'd never imagined being attacked and left for dead either. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns. What surprised her most was that she wasn't afraid. Despite everything that had happened, despite being alone with a man she'd known less than a month in the middle of nowhere, she felt safer than she had in a long time. Jackson had proven himself trustworthy in every way. He'd never made her feel uncomfortable, never taken advantage of her vulnerability. He treated her with respect and kindness, and that meant more than all the fancy courting she'd experienced in Denver. As autumn settled over the Colorado territory, Grace threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life. Jackson proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to care for the horses, how to mend fences, how to recognize good grazing land. She learned to milk the cow he bought from a neighboring ranch, to gather eggs from the chickens they acquired, to preserve food for the coming winter. The work was hard and physical in a way Grace had never experienced. Her hands, once soft and unused to labor, developed calluses. Her arms grew stronger from hauling water and feed. She learned to ignore the aches and pains that came with the work, finding satisfaction in the tangible results of her efforts. Jackson was true to his word about building an addition to the cabin. He spent his evenings after the daily work was done constructing a small room off the main cabin that would serve as Grace's private quarters. She helped when she could, holding boards steady while he hammered, learning the basics of construction. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, or sometimes talking about their days, their plans, their observations about the weather and the animals. It was during these quiet evening hours that Grace found herself falling in love with Jackson Zimmerman, though she didn't recognize it at first. She noticed the way his brow furrowed in concentration when he was measuring a board, the way he hummed tunelessly when he was content, the way he always made sure she ate enough at meals. She noticed how his rare smiles made her stomach flutter, how his laugh made her want to hear it again and again. Jackson was fighting his own battle with his growing feelings. He'd never been in love before, had never had time or opportunity for romance during his years of constant travel and hard work. But Grace had changed everything. She'd brought life and warmth to his lonely cabin. She made him want to build something bigger than just a successful ranch. When he looked at her, he saw a future he'd never dared to imagine for himself. One night in late October, after they'd finished working on her room, they sat outside on the porch Jackson had built the previous summer. The air was crisp and cool, and the stars were brilliant in the clear sky. Grace wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and looked up at the constellations. "You ever get lonely out here?" she asked quietly. Jackson considered the question. "I used to think I liked the solitude." After years of living in crowded bunkhouses and noisy cattle camps, having my own place to myself seemed like paradise. He paused. But I realize now I was confusing peace and quiet with loneliness. I didn't know the difference until you came along. Grace turned to look at him, and in the lamplight spilling from the cabin window, Jackson could see the question in her eyes. "What are you saying, Jackson?" He took a deep breath, knowing this moment would change everything between them for better or worse. "I'm saying that having you here has made me realize what I was missing. I'm saying that I look forward to every morning because I know I'll spend the day with you. I'm saying that the thought of you leaving, of you going somewhere else, makes me realize this cabin would feel empty again, even though it never felt empty before." "Jackson," Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know this isn't proper," he continued, needing to get the words out before he lost his courage. "I know we haven't known each other long, and I know you've been through something terrible and might not be ready for any of this. But I need you to know that I've fallen in love with you, Grace Reynolds, completely and absolutely in love with you." The silence that followed felt eternal. Jackson watched Grace's face, trying to read her expression, wondering if he'd just ruined everything. Then Grace smiled, and it was like the sun coming up. "You foolish, wonderful man. I've been falling in love with you too, but I was afraid you just saw me as an obligation, someone you rescued and felt responsible for." "Never," Jackson said firmly, turning to face her fully. "You stopped being an obligation the moment you opened your eyes and I saw your strength. Every day since has only made me admire you more, respect you more, love you more." Grace reached out and took his hand, the first truly intimate gesture either of them had made. Jackson's larger hand closed around hers, warm and calloused and steady. "I never expected to find this," Grace said softly. "When those men attacked us, when I thought I was going to die out there in the dirt, I never imagined that I'd end up here with you, feeling happier than I've ever felt in my life. Is that terrible? That something good came from something so awful?" "No," Jackson said, squeezing her hand gently. "That's not terrible. That's life. We can't control what happens to us, but we can control what we do with it. You could have let what happened break you, but instead you became stronger. That's not terrible, Grace. That's beautiful." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, both marveling at this unexpected turn their lives had taken. Finally, Grace spoke again. "What happens now?" Jackson smiled. "Well, I suppose I should court you properly. Take you into town, let me buy you dinner, maybe go to a dance if there's one happening." Grace laughed. "That seems a bit backwards, considering we've been living together for 2 months. "Fair point," Jackson conceded, "but I still want to do this right. I want everyone to know my intentions are honorable. I want to marry you, Grace. Not tomorrow or next week, but when you're ready. I want to build this ranch with you, build a life with you. I want to fall asleep next to you every night and wake up to you every morning. I want to make you happy for the rest of your days if you'll let me." Tears filled Grace's eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it. I want that too. I want it more than I've ever wanted anything." Jackson pulled her close, and Grace went willingly, resting her head on his shoulder as his arm came around her. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars and planning their future, neither of them quite believing how lucky they were to have found each other. The next morning, Jackson rode into the nearby town of Golden, Colorado, to speak with the preacher about marriage requirements. Grace stayed back to tend the ranch, but she spent the day in a happy daze, imagining what her wedding day would be like, what their life together would be like. When Jackson returned that evening, he had news. "Preacher says we need to wait 30 days from when we file the intention to marry. That puts us at just before Thanksgiving. How does that sound?" "Perfect," Grace said, and meant it. The next month passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Jackson took Grace into Golden several times to meet people and to shop for things they'd need. Grace was nervous about facing a town full of strangers, but Jackson stayed close to her side, and his obvious devotion and respect for her seemed to smooth over any potential gossip about their living arrangements. They met with the preacher, a kind older man named Reverend Hendricks, who'd been serving the Golden community for 15 years. He agreed to marry them in the small church on the Saturday before Thanksgiving. Grace found fabric to make herself a simple but pretty dress, cream-colored with delicate embroidery. One of the women in town, Mrs. Patterson, a warm-hearted widow who ran the general store, took Grace under her wing and helped her with the sewing. "Jackson Zimmerman is a good man," Mrs. Patterson told Grace one afternoon as they worked on the dress. "Known him since he bought that land 3 years back. He's always been honest, hard-working, keeps to himself mostly. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you, though. That man is head over heels in love." Grace felt her cheeks warm with pleasure. "I'm very lucky." "You both are," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "Love like that doesn't come along every day. You hold on to it tight, you hear." The wedding day arrived clear and cold, with a dusting of snow on the ground that made everything look clean and new. Grace wore her cream dress with her hair pinned up, and Jackson wore his best suit, looking nervous and happy in equal measure. There weren't many guests, just a handful of townspeople who'd gotten to know them over the past month, but it didn't matter. The only person Grace cared about seeing was Jackson, standing at the altar waiting for her. As she walked down the short aisle of the little church, Grace reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few months. She'd lost her uncle, nearly lost her own life, and found love she never expected. As she reached Jackson and took his hands, she knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Jackson gazed at Grace with such love in his eyes that it made her breath catch. When Reverend Hendricks asked if he took this woman to be his wife, Jackson's "I do" rang out clear and strong. When it was Grace's turn, she said her vows with equal conviction. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife and told Jackson he could kiss his bride, Jackson leaned in slowly, giving Grace time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't want to. She met him halfway, and their first kiss was sweet and gentle and full of promise. The small gathering cheered, and Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her eyes. After the ceremony, everyone gathered at the Patterson house for a simple celebration. There was food and music and laughter, and Grace found herself swept up in the joy of the day. She danced with Jackson, his arms around her waist, her head resting against his chest, and felt more content than she'd ever thought possible. As the sun started to set, Jackson and Grace made their excuses and headed back to their ranch. The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what the evening would bring. Grace felt nervous but excited. Jackson seemed to sense her feelings and took her hand. "We don't have to rush anything," he said quietly. "Tonight and every night we move at your pace. I want you to feel safe and loved always." Grace squeezed his hand. "I do feel safe. I love you, Jackson." "I love you too, Grace, more than words can say." That night, in the privacy of their cabin, they came together as husband and wife. Jackson was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure Grace felt cherished. Despite her nervousness, Grace found herself responding to his touch, to his whispered words of love. What could have been awkward instead felt natural and right. The physical expression of the deep, emotional connection they'd built over the past months. Afterwards, lying in Jackson's arms in the bed that had once been just his and was now theirs, Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Did I hurt you?" Jackson asked immediately, concern evident in his voice. "No," Grace assured him, turning to face him. "These are happy tears. I never thought I could feel this way, this complete. Thank you for being patient with me, for loving me the way you do." Jackson kissed her forehead softly. "Thank you for trusting me, for choosing to build a life with me. I promise I'll spend every day trying to make you happy." "You already do," Grace said simply. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, warm and content despite the cold November night outside. The winter that followed was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter temperatures. But inside the cabin, Grace and Jackson built a warm life together. They worked side by side during the days, tending to the animals and maintaining the property. Jackson taught Grace to shoot, insisting she needed to be able to protect herself if anything ever happened. Grace proved to be a natural, her steady hands and sharp eye making her an excellent shot. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Grace often mending clothes or knitting while Jackson maintained his tack or whittled. Sometimes they would read aloud to each other from the few books they owned. Other times they would simply talk, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for their future, observations about their daily lives. They made love often, growing more comfortable with each other's bodies, learning what brought pleasure. Grace discovered a passionate side of herself she'd never known existed, and Jackson reveled in being able to bring her joy. Their physical connection deepened the emotional bond between them, until it seemed impossible that they'd only known each other for such a short time. As spring arrived and the snow melted, revealing the greening land beneath, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be sure before telling Jackson. One evening in early April, after they'd finished dinner, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There's going to be 3 of us come fall," she said softly. Jackson's eyes went wide with understanding, then filled with tears. "A baby. We're having a baby." Grace nodded, smiling at his reaction. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Jackson pulled her into his arms. "I'm more than happy. I'm terrified and excited and grateful all at once. A baby, Grace, our baby." "Our baby," Grace repeated, loving the sound of it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Grace continued to help with the ranch work as much as she could, though Jackson became increasingly protective, not wanting her to overexert herself. They spent the warm evenings planning for the baby's arrival, Jackson building a cradle from smooth pine wood, Grace sewing tiny clothes and blankets. Mrs. Patterson from town visited regularly, bringing supplies and advice. She'd agreed to assist with the birth, having helped deliver half the babies in Golden over the years. Grace was grateful for the older woman's friendship and experience. In late September, Grace went into labor. It was a long, difficult process that left Jackson pacing outside the bedroom door, feeling helpless and terrified. He could hear Grace crying out in pain, and it took everything in him not to burst into the room. Mrs. Patterson had firmly told him to stay out, that childbirth was women's work, but every sound of distress from his wife made him want to be by her side. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard a different sound, the sharp cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Jackson, a big, healthy boy, and Grace did wonderfully. She's tired but fine." Jackson rushed past her into the room. Grace lay propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but glowing with happiness. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she'd made. Jackson approached slowly, almost afraid he might break the spell of this perfect moment. "Come meet your son," Grace said softly, looking up at him with love in her eyes. Jackson sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. The infant had a shock of dark hair and tiny features that seemed to shift between expressions as he slept. Jackson reached out one finger, and the baby's tiny hand curled around it reflexively. Something in Jackson's chest cracked open at that moment, a flood of love so intense it was almost painful. "He's perfect," Jackson whispered. "You're both perfect. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for this gift." Grace leaned her head against Jackson's shoulder. "What should we name him?" They discussed names over the past months but hadn't settled on anything definite. Jackson thought for a moment, looking at his son, then at his wife. "Thomas," he said, "after your uncle, so a part of him lives on." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "That's perfect. Thomas Zimmerman." Uncle Thomas would have been so proud. Mrs. Patterson left after making sure Grace and the baby were settled, promising to return the next day to check on them. Jackson spent that first night sitting in the chair beside the bed, watching his wife and son sleep, marveling at how his life had transformed in just 1 year. Little Thomas proved to be a relatively easy baby, though the adjustment to having an infant in the house took some getting used to. Grace was exhausted from the constant feedings and lack of sleep, but she approached motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. Jackson helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy, changing diapers, doing whatever was needed so Grace could rest. The ranch work continued, and Jackson hired a young man from town named Billy to help with the daily tasks so he could spend more time with his family. Grace slowly regained her strength and returned to her usual routines, though now with a baby strapped to her back or napping in the cradle. Jackson moved from room to room so Thomas was always nearby. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Jackson had expanded their cattle herd and acquired more horses. The vegetable garden Grace tended provided more than enough food for their needs with surplus to sell in town. They'd added a proper addition to the cabin, with a separate bedroom for Thomas and a larger living space. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable and filled with love. Thomas was 2 years old when Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was less surprising but no less joyful. Jackson swept her up in his arms and spun her around, making her laugh. "Another blessing," he said when he set her down. "I can't believe how lucky I am." Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after Grace's mother, arrived in the spring of Thomas's 3rd year. She had Grace's green eyes and Jackson's stubborn chin, and from the moment she entered the world crying with impressive volume, it was clear she had a strong personality. Life with 2 small children was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Thomas was a curious, active boy who followed his father everywhere, wanting to help with everything. Margaret was quieter but no less determined, and she and Thomas already had a bond that made Grace's heart swell. One evening, when Thomas was 5 and Margaret was 2, the family sat outside watching the sunset. Thomas was chattering about the foal that had been born that morning, and Margaret was making her stuffed rabbit dance. Jackson had his arm around Grace's shoulders, and she leaned into him contentedly. "You ever think about that day I found you on the trail?" Jackson asked quietly. Grace was silent for a moment, considering. "Sometimes. It feels like a lifetime ago, like it happened to someone else. But then I remember how scared I was, how hopeless everything seemed, and I realize how much has changed." "You have any regrets about staying here, about this life?" Grace turned to look at him, reading the insecurity in his eyes. Even after all these years, Jackson sometimes worried that she'd given up too much, that she missed the civilization and society she'd left behind. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "This life, this family, you, are everything I never knew I wanted. I found myself out here, Jackson. The real me, not the version of me I thought I was supposed to be, and I found you. How could I regret any of that?" Jackson kissed her softly, then pulled back with a smile. "Good, because I have something to tell you. I bought the adjacent property, the Henderson place. They're moving back east, and I got a good price. That doubles our land." Grace's eyes widened. "Jackson, that's wonderful, but can we afford it?" "Barely," he admitted. "But it's a good investment. With more land, we can expand the herd significantly. In a few years, we'll be one of the biggest ranches in the area." "A few years," Grace mused. "Thomas will be old enough to really help then. And Margaret too, though she'll probably insist on doing everything her own way." "She gets that from her mother," Jackson teased, earning him a playful swat on the arm. As the years passed, Jackson's prediction proved accurate. The ranch grew and prospered. They added buildings, expanded the herds, hired more help. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Margaret, true to form, charted her own course, showing a talent for working with the horses that surpassed even Jackson's considerable skill. 3 more children joined the family over the years. Another son named William when Margaret was 4, twin girls named Sarah and Elizabeth when William was 3. The cabin had grown into a sprawling ranch house with enough room for everyone, and then some. The sound of children's laughter and running feet filled the halls, and Grace often paused in her work to simply listen and smile. Jackson's hair started to show gray at the temples, and Grace found a few silver threads in her own dark hair. Their hands bore the calluses and scars of years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who'd fallen in love on this same piece of land, who'd built a life and a family from nothing but determination and devotion. One evening, 20 years after Jackson had found Grace on that dusty trail, they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset. The children were all inside, the older ones helping the younger ones get ready for bed. From within the house came the sounds of a normal evening, voices and laughter and the occasional squabble. 20 years, Grace said softly. "Can you believe it?" "Some days yes, some days no," Jackson replied. "When I look at everything we've built, it feels like 20 years. But when I look at you, it feels like yesterday that I first saw those green eyes looking up at me." "Flatterer," Grace said, but she was smiling. "It's not flattery if it's true." Jackson took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in a gesture that had become habitual over the years. "You know what I was thinking about today?" "What?" "That day I found you. What if I'd taken a different trail? What if I'd ridden by 5 minutes earlier or later and missed you? What if you'd died out there before I came along?" Grace squeezed his hand. "But you didn't take a different trail. You found me exactly when you were meant to. I believe that, Jackson. I believe we were meant to find each other." "So do I," Jackson said. "Every day I wake up grateful. Grateful I took that trail, grateful I found you, grateful you chose to stay, grateful for every moment since." "Me too," Grace said. "Even the hard moments, because they led us here." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sky turned from pink to purple to deep blue. Stars began to emerge one by one, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding night, the birth of each of their children, every milestone in their 20 years together. Thomas came out onto the porch, now a young man of 22 himself. "Ma, Pa, Margaret needs help with the twins. They won't settle down for bed." Grace started to rise, but Jackson held her hand. "I'll go. You stay here and enjoy the evening." He kissed her forehead and went inside, leaving Grace and Thomas alone on the porch. "You and Pa seem happy," Thomas observed, sitting in the chair his father had vacated. "We are," Grace said simply. "I hope I find what you two have someday," Thomas said. "The way he looks at you, the way you work together, that's something special." Grace smiled at her eldest child, her heart full. "You will, Thomas. When the time is right and with the right person, you'll build something just as special, maybe different but just as meaningful." "How did you know Pa was the right one?" Grace thought about it. "I didn't, not at first. But he showed me, through his actions, through his consistency, through his kindness. And somewhere along the way, I realized I couldn't imagine my life without him in it. That's when I knew." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, then stood. "I better go help with the twins before Pa pulls his hair out." "You know how they get when they're overtired," Grace laughed. "Go on then, and Thomas, thank you. For what? For being you, for being such a wonderful young man. Your father and I are very proud of you." Thomas ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "Love you, Ma. Love you too, son." After he went inside, Grace sat alone for a few more minutes, reflecting on her life. She thought about her parents, gone so many years now. She thought about Uncle Thomas, who'd been trying to give her a new start when his life was cut short. She hoped they could see her now, see the life she'd built, the family she'd created. She hoped they knew she was happy when Jackson came back out victorious in his mission to settle the twins. Grace stood and took his hand. "Let's go to bed," she said softly. "Tired?" Jackson asked, concerned. "No," Grace said, and the look she gave him made his pulse quicken even after 20 years of marriage. "Just want to be alone with my husband." Jackson's smile was slow and warm. "Well, Mrs. Zimmerman, I think that can be arranged." They went inside, checking on each of their children as they passed their rooms, then closed the door to their own bedroom. This room, this bed, had been the site of so much of their life together. Quiet conversations and passionate embraces, tears and laughter, plans and dreams. It was sacred ground in its way. That night, they made love with the familiarity of long practice, but also with tenderness and passion that hadn't dimmed with time. Afterwards, Grace lay with her head on Jackson's chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling completely at peace. "I love you," she whispered. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Jackson replied, his arms tightening around her. "You saved me, Grace. I didn't even know I needed saving until I found you on that trail. But you gave me purpose and joy and a reason to build something lasting." "We saved each other," Grace corrected gently, "and we built something beautiful together." As the years continued to pass, the Zimmerman Ranch became one of the most successful in the region. Thomas eventually took over more of the daily operations, allowing Jackson to slow down a bit, though he never fully retired. He couldn't imagine not being involved in the place he'd built from nothing. Margaret married a horse trainer she met at a county fair and brought him to live and work on the ranch. William developed an interest in the business side of ranching and managed the financial aspects. Sarah became a teacher in Golden but lived at home and helped in the evenings and weekends. Elizabeth showed her mother's talent for gardening and took over managing the extensive vegetable gardens and fruit trees Grace had planted over the years. Jackson and Grace became grandparents when Thomas married a quiet woman named Emily, and they had a son named James. More grandchildren followed as their other children married and started families. The ranch house that had once been a tiny cabin echoed with the sounds of multiple generations. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. There were nearly 30 people crowded into the house and spilling out onto the porch and yard. Grace looked around at all of them, her children and their spouses, her grandchildren ranging from infants to teenagers, and felt almost overwhelmed by the abundance of her life. Jackson found her standing alone in the kitchen, taking a moment of quiet amid the chaos. "You okay?" he asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Grace leaned back against him. "More than okay, just taking it all in. All of this, all of them, they exist because you rode down a certain trail 30 years ago. It's overwhelming when you think about it." "Then don't think about it," Jackson said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Just enjoy it. We earned this, Grace. Every bit of it." The party continued late into the evening. There was music and dancing and laughter. Jackson and Grace danced together under the stars, the same stars that had watched them fall in love all those years ago. "Still my favorite dancing partner," Jackson murmured in her ear. "I'm your only dancing partner," Grace pointed out. "True. But you'd still be my favorite even if you weren't." As they turned slowly in the lantern light, their children and grandchildren watching with smiles, Grace thought about the life they'd built. It hadn't always been easy. There had been hard winters and dry summers that threatened the herds. There had been illnesses and accidents, worries about money and predators, and all the thousand concerns that came with raising a family and running a ranch. But through it all, they'd had each other. When Grace was overwhelmed, Jackson was her rock. When Jackson doubted himself, Grace reminded him of his strength. They'd been partners in every sense of the word, building not just a ranch but a legacy. The years continued their steady march. Jackson and Grace grew older, their steps slower, their joints stiffer in the cold mornings. But their love never wavered. If anything, it deepened with time, aged like fine wine into something rich and complex and irreplaceable. On a warm summer evening when they were both in their 60s, Jackson and Grace sat on their porch watching the sunset, as had become their habit. Jackson's hair was completely gray now, and Grace's dark hair was streaked with silver. Their hands, clasped together as always, were weathered and marked by age and work. "You remember what you said to me the day we got married?" Jackson asked. "I said a lot of things that day," Grace replied with a smile. "You said you'd love me until your last breath and beyond." "I did. And I meant it. I know you did. But Grace, I need you to know something." Jackson turned to look at her directly. "I need you to know that every day with you has been a gift, every single day. The good ones and the hard ones and the ordinary ones, all of them, because I got to spend them with you." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Where is this coming from?" "Nowhere specific. I just wanted you to know. We don't know how much time we have left, whether it's years or decades. But however much time we get, I want you to know that I treasure every moment, that you made my life worth living. That finding you on that trail was the best thing that ever happened to me." "Oh, Jackson," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks now. "You made my life worth living too. You gave me a home and a family and a love I never dreamed possible. I found myself when I found you." They held each other as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, a fitting backdrop for a love story that had begun on a dusty trail and grown into something extraordinary. True to their resilient nature, Jackson and Grace lived many more years together. They celebrated their 40th anniversary, then their 50th. Their family continued to grow and prosper. The Zimmerman Ranch became legendary in the region, not just for its success, but for the family that ran it, a family known for their integrity and hard work and loyalty to each other. When Jackson was 75 and Grace was 73, they took a trip back to the spot where he'd found her all those years ago. It took them longer to make the ride than it once would have, but they were both still capable on horseback, though their children had worried and fussed. They stood on the trail, trying to remember exactly where Grace had been lying. It seemed impossible now that this dusty, unremarkable stretch of road had been the site of such a momentous meeting. "Right there," Grace said finally, pointing to a spot beside a distinctive rock formation. "I remember that rock. I was staring at it, trying to focus on it instead of the pain." Jackson dismounted and walked to the spot, Grace following more slowly. They stood there together, remembering. "If someone had told me that day that I was standing at the beginning of the greatest adventure of my life, I wouldn't have believed them," Grace said. "If someone had told me that the unconscious woman I was about to find would become my wife and the mother of my children and the love of my life, I would have thought they were crazy," Jackson added. They were quiet for a moment, paying silent tribute to the younger versions of themselves who'd met on this spot, who'd had no idea what the future held. "Thank you," Grace said finally. "For what? For stopping, for helping me, for loving me, for everything." Jackson took her hand. "Thank you for trusting me, for staying, for building this life with me, for loving me back." They rode home slowly, in no rush, comfortable in the silence and in each other's company. That night in the bed they'd shared for over 50 years, they held each other close. "Promise me something," Grace whispered in the dark. "Anything. Promise me that wherever we go after this life, we'll find each other again. I can't imagine any existence without you in it." "I promise," Jackson said without hesitation. "In this life and whatever comes after, I'll find you. I'll always find you." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, two souls so intertwined that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. When Jackson passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by his family, Grace held his hand and whispered one last, "I love you." She knew he heard her, even as his spirit left his body. She felt it in the slight squeeze of his fingers, in the small smile that touched his lips. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Jackson had touched many lives over his years, but none more profoundly than Grace's. She stood at his grave, supported by her children, and felt a piece of her soul go into the ground with him. But Grace was strong. She'd always been strong, and she knew Jackson wouldn't want her to give up on life just because he was gone. So she continued, running the ranch with her children and grandchildren, telling stories about Jackson to the great-grandchildren who'd never known him, keeping his memory alive through her words and actions. 2 years later, on a cool autumn evening very much like the one when Jackson had first told her he loved her, Grace passed away in her sleep. She went peacefully, a smile on her face, and those who found her said it looked like she'd been dreaming of something wonderful. She was buried next to Jackson, under a large oak tree they'd planted together 40 years earlier. The headstone was simple: Grace Zimmerman, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. But if you looked closely, you could see a second inscription below. She was found unconscious on a trail and found love that lasted beyond a lifetime. The Zimmerman Ranch continued to thrive under the care of their descendants, a living testament to what two people could build when they found each other at exactly the right moment. The story of how Jackson found Grace and how they fell in love became family legend, passed down through generations. A reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the very best things. And on quiet evenings, when the sunset paints the Colorado sky in shades of orange and purple, some say you can still see two figures on the porch of the old ranch house, sitting side by side, hands clasped, watching the day end together. Because love like that doesn't die. It just transforms into something eternal, something that echoes through time, inspiring everyone lucky enough to hear its story. The legacy of Jackson and Grace Zimmerman lived on not just in their descendants and their ranch, but in the example they set of what true partnership looked like. They'd shown that love wasn't just passion and romance, though they'd had plenty of both. Love was also choosing to be there day after day, working side by side, building something together that neither could have built alone. It was sacrifice and compromise and absolute devotion. It was finding someone who made you want to be better, and then spending your life becoming that better person with them at your side. Years turned to decades, and the Zimmerman Ranch remained a fixture in Colorado, a place where family values and hard work were still honored, where the story of the couple who'd founded it all was still told with reverence and love. Because in a world that often seemed chaotic and uncertain, the story of Jackson and Grace was a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, love does conquer all. That one moment of choosing compassion over indifference, of stopping to help instead of riding past, can change not just two lives but generations of lives to come. And so their story ends where it began, on a dusty trail in Colorado, where a cowboy found an unconscious woman and saved her life, never knowing that she would save his right back, that together they would create something beautiful and lasting. It ends with love triumphant, with a family thriving, with a legacy that would endure far beyond the years they walked the earth. It ends, as all the best love stories do, with the promise that true love never really ends at all.